Former is first, in case you were wondering. Former first, latter last. That makes sense. Oh, with this new trend in kindness, where board game designers are using cyan, magenta, and bumblebee colors to make kicking your friend's asses more streamlined for colorblind folks, Hues and Hues is to colorblind people what a baby suckling a live grenade is to healthy childhood development. While I do think it's kind of hilarious that they essentially tell this entire group of people that the board game community has been trying to accommodate to go pound sand, the punchline likely would have hit a lot harder if people with functional rods and cones had any idea what the fuck they were doing with Hues and Hues in the first place. Blue's Clues is one of those games that's more functional than it is fun. In fact, it's less of a game and more of a glorified version of Pin the Tail on the Donkey. You're given a board with hundreds of colored squares on them that represent the spectrum of visible light. Or at least most of it, all the way from burst appendix bruised blue to unwiped butthole brown, each with a numerically identifiable index. One player draws a card with several colors and their indices on them. They choose one of them, and their goal is to get the other players to place their pawns as closely to their chosen color on the board as possible. They only get 3 words to do it, though, with players guessing once after the first word and again after the next 2, which might have made for a valuable limitation if identifying objects by their color wasn't an ability shared by most of the people that have made it through preschool. It's a guessing game. It says so on the box. The only thing capable of discerning the minute differences in color between adjacent squares is a mantis shrimp. And even then it would be relying on the description of some jabroni whose most challenging experience in color distinction was the time they ordered a slushie. Here's how almost every round of Snooze You Lose works. The card reader says something asinine like chocolate. Everybody places their pawns all over the obviously brown spaces because everybody knows what the fuck chocolate looks like. The second clue is then provided. Oak wood. And since all the correct spaces are probably already taken, players just pack their pawns as close to their original guess as possible. Partly because they're forced to, and partly because they might contain the 4 or 5 photons necessary for a correct answer. 3 spaces is the difference between getting full points and getting no points. But 3 spaces is often the difference between Eastern Swiss sugar-free chocolate and Western Swiss reduced fat cocoa. So unless you and the card reader are looking at these colors through a fucking mass spectrometer, you might as well be making your guesses by flinging spoonfuls of mashed potatoes at the board. It's actually 3 spaces is the difference between 3 points and 1 point. If you're here, you get 3 points. If you're here, you get 1 if you're along the perimeter. Can you tell the difference? Full points, no points. Full, no. Full, no. Full points, no points. If you go here, you're in the lead. If you go here, you get nothing. Nothing! I've heard people claim it's interesting because you get to witness how differently people see color. Like if your clue is mustard, then you can see in your group who prefers Dijon and who is sensible. But all that does is reiterate the main flaw of the game's design. Because if the clue is mustard, matching the shade of yellow you have in your head to that handful of indiscernible spots on the board is where the challenge lies, not in accurately determining what the clue giver was thinking. And the former will always be a random guess unless you have an antenna implanted in your skull that can accurately identify colors by their hex value and send them right to your cortex. Even if the clue giver had 1,000 words, they still wouldn't be able to accurately identify every color on the board without pointing at it. How is it at all fun to decide between several barely distinguishable shades of the same color based on a description given by your friend who's more than likely drunk? I don't even understand why there needs to be 2 guesses. Remove 1 pawn for each player, cut the score for victory in half, and suddenly the random guess you make every round is more interesting because the stakes are higher and there's more riding on it. The score track could do with a liposuction anyways, because the few times that I've played Dudes in Shoes, we quit halfway through because everybody got bored of it. You might think 2 hints would provide the clue giver with an interesting opportunity to sacrifice their first hint in order to set up a 3-word chromatic homing missile on their second, but the reader scores more points the closer players are to the actual answer, so they're incentivized to make both descriptions as accurate as possible, which is stupid because accuracy in this game requires the eyeballs of an octopus, or more appropriately, the luck of Frain Selak. Selak? Selick. Selick? Frain Selak. Look him up.
Meet Frain Selak.
Frain Selak. What results is a game so boring, it's literally on par with watching paint dry. There isn't much of a game here at all. The clue giver plays the role of a color by number book, and the players are all first graders with unhindered access to the crayon bucket while a Gestapo agent stands by ready to smack their hands with a ruler if they choose cotton candy instead of piggy pink. It's not difficult or interesting or self-reflective or detailed or creative or fun. You don't even have to come up with words. The game tells you can't use colors as clues, but I don't understand why. You could say ruby and rose petal as your 2 hints, or you could just say dark red. People's guesses aren't going to be any different. That's no fun. You got to make something up. You can't just say a color, then we'll know exactly where to go on the board. If you don't know exactly where to go on the board when I say ruby, then maybe you should, when I say exactly on the board, I mean like the grouping of the red squares. You know a ruby's red. Everybody knows a ruby's red. But actually discerning how red a ruby is, down to the wavelength, that's psychotic. Nobody can do that! Obviously, it's to give players the illusion of control, to make them feel like they're actually doing something, which is perhaps News on the Tube's biggest achievement, making people feel like they're actually doing something, when they're not doing anything at all. Identifying objects by their color is something preschoolers do, and the only thing I did in preschool that I still think is fun is cocaine. When someone says lemon, knowing that they're referring to a yellow object might be impressive to a 4-year-old that's recently been submerged in a vat of mercury for 12 weeks, but being able to identify exactly what shade of yellow down to the wavelength requires expensive scientific equipment that does not come shipped with the game. At this point, you might be slightly concerned for my mental well-being, getting this worked up about a game for kids, or you might be a kid yourself, in which case I'd like to say, don't watch this video. There's a lot of naughty words in it. I probably should have said that a lot sooner. However, I personally don't think that the argument that this is a children's game holds weight. I know elementary schoolers that play games like Everdell and Wingspan with their parents. And no, don't ask me how I know elementary schoolers. Don't get me wrong, kids are fucking stupid, but you don't have to be smart to be good at board games. I mean, just look at Sergei Kiryakin. There are tons of lightweight, easy-to-learn games out there that are fun, interesting, and accessible for all ages. Plus, who knows? Having your kid engage in problem-solving beyond an unforgiving version of basic object classification, like they're watching an episode of Dora the Explorer from inside a gulag, might undo all the damage their school lunches are doing to them. If you're interested in playing a lightweight party game based on subjective responses that your little cumsprout can join in on, you're not exactly locked in a jail cell. Scattergories, Balderdash, Apples to Apples, Catchphrase, Pictionary, you know, all those games in your grandmother's attic, those are, at the very least, games. If instead you just want to be rewarded for random guesses, then go flip open a phone book and start flirting with people whose names you find sexy. Like me. Ugh.